today my group, which includes Michelle Afawas, Fong Win, Yamil Teles-Garon, and Sally York, will be doing the stock portfolio on Apple, General Motors, British Petroleum, and Chinese Eastern Airlines. A little background on the multinational corporations. Apple Incorporation, founded in 1977, is a company that designs, manufactures, and markets many different types of technological devices, such as smartphones, personal computers, tablets, and wearable accessories, which market to all consumers. General Motors, founded in 1908, is a company that designs, builds, and sells different motorized vehicles and parts worldwide, as well as develops safety and security features for the regular consumers as well as for companies and governments. British Petroleum, founded in 1889, is part of the energy business, which works in different types of energy from oil and natural gas to crude oil and gas pipelines and petroleum. And lastly, China Eastern Airlines, founded in 1988, is a company that operates within the civil aviation industry, offering services ranging from passengers to operations to cargo within the People's Republic of China and internationally as well. They are also in the development of technology and products within the field of aviation.
Apple's stock price showed a 14.17% change, with the starting price of $312 to $268, which was the ending price for a project. A primary reason for this lower price is the COVID-19 global pandemic. Most consumers are focused on purchasing basic necessities and paying bills. Apple's announcement of a new iPhone SE starting at $399 did not really show a drastic change in the stock price because not many people are going out to purchase new electronics. General Motors showed a 36.33% change in their stock price. The firm has plans for electric vehicles, but the drop in oil prices has begun to question these plans. This is because as oil becomes cheaper, gasoline also becomes cheaper, and not many are going to be willing to buy new electric vehicles. British Petroleum also showed a decrease in stock price by a 44.26% change. Their stock was priced at $38, it ended at $21. A reason for this is the crude oil's price dropped to negative territory because of the lack of storage due to the global pandemic that has lowered consumption of oil. Chinese Eastern Airlines also showed a decrease in stock price by a 34.09% change. The primary reason is the pandemic also, which has slowed the travel by air to different countries due to the social distancing measures imposed around the world. Overall, our portfolio decreased by a 32.22% change. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted most economies. Consumers are not purchasing as much, and production of certain goods has slowed down. So, does the U.S. market influence Apple's performance? In the chart below, we have Apple's stock performance in dark blue and the S&P 500 index in light blue. In general, Apple appears to perform higher than the U.S. market. It also appears that Apple's performance is influenced by the U.S. market, given that their trend lines show similar performances. The only main difference is around late October of 2019, Apple experienced a decrease that is not reflected in the U.S. market trend line. This discrepancy can likely be explained by the fact that Apple's production of products is conducted primarily in China. Because of the coronavirus, Apple was experiencing production problems before the U.S. market began to experience problems as a result of the COVID-19. This issue with supply is definitely not attractive to investors and took a temporary toll on Apple's performance. Despite this, the U.S. market still has considerable influence over Apple's performance. Next, we have whether or not the U.S. market has influence over General Motors' performance. Depicted in the chart is General Motors as dark blue and the S&P 500 index as light blue. General Motors, as depicted as of recently, performs lower than the U.S. market. Somewhere in the middle of November, General Motors went from performing higher than the U.S. market to performing lower than the U.S. market. This shift in performance is likely due to union strikes that General Motors began to deal with in September of 2019. The United Auto Workers General Motors Department conducted a 40-day strike as negotiations for a new 4-year labor contract commenced. This strike by the UAW completely shut down production in General Motors' American branches and cost General Motors approximately more than $2 billion. Naturally, investors were wary of investing in General Motors, which substantially affected General Motors' stock performance. Aside from that, General Motors' trend line does show resemblance to the U.S. market trend line, but shows that the U.S. market does have an influence over General Motors' performance. Up next is the question, does the British market influence BP's performance? The graph below depicts BP as dark blue and the FTSE 100 index as light blue. Between November and December of 2016, BP's performance fluctuated above and below the British market's performance.
This is likely due to the fact that BP's profits were down due to a lot of facts. One notable fact being that there was an increase in their Gulf of Mexico oil spill payments from the Deepwater oil spill incident in 2010. This decrease in profits likely drove some investors to sell stock and other investors to purchase stock thinking that BP will recover. BP appears to have suffered greater losses to Corona than the British market in March of 2020. The greater loss can be contributed to the troubled worldwide oil market. With increasing supply, decreasing storage, decreasing prices, and potential threat of price competition, the oil industry is hurting and BP's performance has tanked. However, for the most part, BP's performance shows similarities to the British markets, which shows that the British market does have some influence over BP's performance. Finally, does the Chinese market influence Chinese Eastern Airlines' performance? Depicted below is the Chinese Eastern Airlines as dark blue and the Shenzhen Component Index as light blue. There is a lot of crossover between the performance of Chinese Eastern Airlines and the Chinese market. In late 2019, the Chinese market was faced with trade tensions with the US and Corona crippling its workforce. But at the time, there were no restrictions on international or domestic travel, so Chinese Eastern Airlines was not impacted too much by the Chinese market. Once travel restrictions were put in place, we began to see the Chinese Eastern Airlines performance decrease. From there, we can begin to see some slight similarities between the Chinese market's performance and the Chinese Eastern Airlines performance. So it can be concluded that the Chinese market has some influence on the Chinese Eastern Airlines performance, however, the influence is minimal.
The foreign stocks, although not from the same countries as shown from the chart, display similar behaviors. Both BP and Chinese Eastern Airlines have trends that resemble the same downflows and spikes or rises in prices of the foreign stocks. Both stocks are highly correlated because they do go up or down around the same time, but they do not change by the same exact amounts. The world's markets shift together as global factors change the perspective into which the investors view their stocks or try to protect their money and their investments. British Petroleum and the S&P 500 index over the last 6 months is shown above. The US market does definitely have an influence in British Petroleum stock. The price of it moves along with the market. Factors around the world affect the prices of stocks in all markets. The global pandemic is one of these factors. The first month shown here, November of 2019, does not clearly demonstrate the US market influencing BP stock. The S&P 500 increases while the BP stock took a small decrease in the price. But overall, the US market seems to affect BP's performance. They move in a similar manner. As consumption of oil decreased in recent days and in the previous month, a decline in performance can be seen here due to the COVID-19 pandemic, causing a crisis in the crude oil industry due to the excess production and minimal consumption of this good. Chinese Eastern Airlines with the S&P 500 index over the last 6 months is shown above. From November of 2019 to January 2020, it can be seen that the US market does influence the CEA stock, but the Chinese Eastern Airlines stock does not clearly reflect the movement of the US market. The S&P 500 index representing the US market shows a constant increase during these months, but the Chinese Eastern Airlines shows some decreases in the stock while at the same time conveying an upward movement in price. After January of 2020, the US market and the CEA stock can be seen to mirror the same progress. They both begin to show a decrease while the Chinese Eastern Airlines takes a drastic drop in price between January and towards the end of March. After that, as the US market increases and decreases, the Chinese Eastern Airlines stock mirrors those changes in prices. The COVID-19 pandemic can be considered a factor which displays these drastic price changes due to slowed air traffic and travel worldwide. This includes the US, which has imposed travel restrictions to and from China.
According to Apple's annual report, the majority of its net sales and businesses is done in the Americas region, which is composed of North America and South America. The foreign currency this multinational corporation is most exposed to is the Canadian dollar. Figure on the left illustrates that Apple stock prices have decreased over the investment period. The right figure illustrates that simultaneously, the Canadian dollar strengthened against the USD over the investment period. It is concluded that the Canadian dollar has appreciated against the USD. The relationship between the currency's exchange rate movements and stock performance during this period is a negative correlation. As the foreign currency strengthens against the domestic currency, the stock prices of the corporation decreases. American investors in Apple realize that they will incur losses, so the number of stocks sold increases compared to the number of stocks purchased. Thus, the sales in Canadian dollar that is converted to USD will result in a profit that is less than it would have been before the depreciation of the USD. As a result, the stock price of Apple decreases over this period. According to General Motors' annual report, the majority of its net sales and business is done in China. The foreign currency this multinational corporation is most exposed to is the Chinese yuan. Figure on the left illustrates that General Motors stock prices have decreased over the investment period. The right figure illustrates that simultaneously the Chinese yuan overall strengthened against the USD over the investment period. It is concluded that the Chinese yuan has appreciated against the USD. The relationship between the currency's exchange rate movements and the performance of the stock over the investment period is a negative correlation. As the foreign currency strengthens against the domestic currency, the stock prices of the corporation decreases. American investors in General Motors realize that they will incur losses, so the number of stocks sold increases compared to the number of stocks purchased. The sales in Chinese yuan that is converted to USD will result in a profit that is less than it would have been before the depreciation of the USD. As a result, the stock price of General Motors decreases over this period.
Through an air network, China Eastern Airlines now reaches 1,052 destinations within 177 countries, with majority of its business running in and out of China. The foreign currency this multinational corporation is most exposed to is the US dollar. Figure on the left illustrates that the stock and ADR prices for China Eastern Airlines has decreased over the investment period. The right figure illustrates that the Chinese yuan overall strengthens against the United States dollar over the investment period per 1 USD. Investment at British Petroleum and China Eastern Airlines explore my investments to foreign exchange risk. In the last month, for instance, from the 14th of January to the 21st of April, the exchange rate of the Chinese yuan fluctuates against the US dollar, reaching a maximum of 7.095 and a minimum of 6.86. The relationship between the currency exchange rate movements and the performance of the China Eastern Airlines stock over the investment period is a negative correlation. With the foreign currency, the Chinese yuan strengthens against the domestic currency of the United States dollar, the stock prices of China Eastern Airlines decreases. This means that United States dollar weakens over time. As investors notice that the Chinese yuan strengthens against the United States dollar, the number of stock will increase. As a result, the stock prices of China Eastern Airlines will increase over this period. British Petroleum is an integrated energy business with operations in Europe, North and South America, Australia, Asia, and Africa, with a total of 79 countries of operation. The foreign currency this multinational corporation is most exposed to is the US dollar. Figure on the left illustrates that the stock and ADR prices have decreased over the investment period. The right figures illustrate that the British pound overall weakens against the United States dollar over the 4-month investment period. The British pound fluctuates against the USD, reaching a minimum of 0.757 and a maximum of 0.865. The relationship between the currency exchange rate movements and the performance of the British Petroleum stock over the 4-month investment period is a negative correlation. With the foreign currency of British pounds weakens against the domestic currency of the dollar, the stock prices of British Petroleum decreases. This means that the United States dollar strengthens over time. As investors notices that the British pound weakens against the dollar, the number of stock will decrease. As a result, the stock prices of British Petroleum will decrease over this period.
Now we will discuss the overall portfolio return for the 4 MNCs. Recently, Apple presented a high historical volatility and performed poorly over the last few months. Statistics show that Apple developed a slightly higher expected return compared to the market, but still maintained a negative expected return altogether. Recently, General Motors has been performing poorly over investment period. Compared to the market, data points show that General Motors developed a much higher risk and a much lower expected return. However, both maintain a negative expected return altogether. If the market continues to perform negatively, General Motors will perform less than expected. British Petroleum has been performing very poorly recently while maintaining a high historical volatility. It is standing at a level of risk much higher than the market and an expected return much lower than the market. It is expected that British Petroleum will also underperform in the next few years. China Eastern Airlines Corporation has obtained high level of volatility with poor performances over the investment period. Compared to the overall market, China Eastern Airlines Corporation is positioned with a lower risk and a lower expected return.